The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University. This is EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy. Now, here's your host, Dr. Dan Sutter.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Hulu recently debuted a television series based on the New York Times 1619 Project, which suggested that colonial Virginia in 1619 was where slavery began in the Americas. Slavery was a horrible evil in human society, but it has been widely examined by historians, and the historical reality is that slavery did not begin in the Americas some 400 years ago. The sad truth is that slavery was a part of human society for a very long time and in societies across the globe. It's only been in the past 200 years or so that slavery was eradicated. And it was also during that time that standards of living have taken off in what economic historian Deirdre McCloskey refers to as the Great Enrichment. What lessons does the history of slavery offer for today? Joining me on EconVersations to discuss this is economic historian Lawrence Reed. Mr. Reed served as the president of the Foundation for Economic Education for many years, an outstanding organization dedicated to educating people about how a market economy operates. And it's one that the Johnson Center has partnered with on several projects over the years. Prior to joining FEE, Larry was a professor of economics at Northwood University in Michigan and president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, which is also located in Michigan. Welcome back to the show, Larry.
Hey, thank you for having me, Dan. I appreciate it very much.
Well, you've written several pieces for FEE recently, talk about some of this history of slavery, and we're going to get into some of that. But I think before we get into some of the details, I think we want to touch on why is it so important that we have this perspective on, slavery in human history, and not just slavery in the United States.
Slavery, Dan, is a very unfortunate blot on the human experience, but it is by no means unique to this country. And so those who seem to have an agenda sometimes to attack America often don't want you to know, or they neglect to mention, that slavery is an age-old institution. Mm-hmm. That if America is exceptional on this matter at all, it may be for what we did to get rid of it, but not exceptional because we had it. It goes back to ancient times. Most of the people, in fact, who have ever lived on this planet have either been slaves or lived as near slaves or near serfs in constant subjection to whoever happened to be in power. So it's a common experience, but although it can never be excused or justified, it is by no means exceptional to this country.
And so let's start there. Like in 1619, it turns out actually slavery as imposed by Europeans was already existing in the Americas, because the Spanish had gotten established in the Americas a little bit before that, and they had brought slavery with them, haven't they? That's
right. The Spanish brought slaves nearly a century before the 1619 experience at Jamestown. So they brought slaves to multiple places in the Americas, almost a century before 1619.
And before the Spanish got here, we have pretty good evidence now that many of the indigenous peoples of America had slavery. They didn't always necessarily call it slavery. I know it's oftentimes in the history referred to as captives sometimes as opposed to slaves. But clearly things that we would recognize as human bondage, right?
Yes, the Aztecs, the Mayans in Central America, they had slaves. Some of the tribes of Native Americans engaged in slavery. And a long time before 1619, this is, again, an age-old institution. What we really ought to be thinking about today is the remarkable transformation that the world underwent from centuries of slavery being common to, in just the last 150 years or so, being exceedingly rare by comparison.
Yeah, and And even if we want to think about the slave trade and the enslaving of Africans, the United States, or what is now the United States, isn't the only place that African slaves were sent to. In fact, the statistics show that many more Africans were taken to Brazil in the New World than to the British colonies in North America.
That's right. And the treatment of slaves in Brazil for much of that experience was considerably more brutal than it was ever in America. It's estimated that about 11 million Black Africans were forced to make the journey in slave ships to the Americas. But about 14 million Black Africans made similar, though shorter journeys from Africa to Muslim-controlled countries in the Arab regions of the world. So again, it isn't unique to America. It isn't unique to people of a particular faith or color. It's a ubiquitous institution in history that we only recently have finally begun to shake off.
Yeah, and and as you also mentioned, certainly in Europe, before they started importing slaves from other parts of the world, we had slavery in Europe, as some Europeans were enslaved by others, and certainly we know that back in ancient Greece there was slavery, and Aristotle wrote about it and so forth, right?
Oh, that's exactly right, and often it originated in warfare. Mm-hmm. That people were enslaved after they were first conquered. And in those days, the color of skin didn't matter at all. If ancient Rome or ancient Greece went off to conquer somebody, they didn't care what color they were. If they defeated them, they often enslaved the defeated peoples.
Mm-hmm. And it was only relatively late in slavery that it started to take on this racial or racist dimension. And that was in part because we started to see the emergence of a global slave trade. And I think, as you were describing it at one point, well, we go back 1,000 years, people were poor enough, you just enslaved whoever was nearby you. You weren't going to travel around the world to enslave people. You simply conquered the foe next door and enslaved the survivors.
That's right. But with the coming of ocean-going vessels that could cross the Atlantic in a matter of a few weeks, it certainly made slavery more of an opportunity for the most unscrupulous among us, who thought that, hey, I can capture some people, make some deals with native Africans to capture or buy other Black Africans and take them on a ship and sell them at auction in places like Grenada or Jamaica or other islands in the Caribbean.
No, one thing that's I found interesting, and I think this was from the work of Thomas Sowell, was that in North America, it was one of the few places, because the United States ended the slave trade, the international slave trade, I think in 1807, or fairly soon after the founding of our nation. We ended the slave trade. But the slave population in the United States continued to be stable and actually grow through natural reproduction. And that itself was a bit of an oddity, a rare case, because, for instance, in Brazil, you mentioned how brutal slavery was there, and they had to import many more slaves, because my understanding is that the slavery there was so brutal, they were killing their slaves off so frequently, they had to keep importing new ones to replace the ones that died.
Yeah, that's right. Again, you can't justify or excuse slavery in any form anywhere. But I'll tell you, if I was a slave and I could have chosen where I wanted to end up, I would, and if I knew the facts that Thomas Sowell has uncovered, I would choose America over Brazil, because we, generally speaking, engaged in better treatment. As cruel as it often was, it was still frequently better than in Brazil.
Yeah, and to one extent, I guess Brazil never got called out for its mistreatment of slaves, in part because, unlike the United States, it never made any kind of pretensions or any allusions to being that everybody was free and equal, and so the very callous and mistreatment that happened in Brazil simply didn't generate the same kind of outrage or internal condemnation because of the inconsistency.
That's right. It was the words of the Declaration of Independence that put America on a path of sooner or later recognizing the hypocrisy of
Yeah.
proclaiming the equality of all peoples, but then practicing slavery. Now, many of our founders knew that.
Hmm.
Many of our founders were opposed to slavery, and if they thought they could end it and still keep the colonies together in one new nation, they'd have done it. But there was a compromise, actually,
Right.
with the slave colonies to not end it immediately. But the words of the Declaration surely put it on a path.
Hmm.
Uh, a lot of people even knew at that moment that that would end it one way or the other, sooner or later.
Right. And then, I mean, I guess the one thing that was sort of exceptional about the United States in our experience with slavery compared to other places in the world, because eventually slavery has died out, it was ended across the globe, that we fought this massive civil war in part to end slavery. And it wasn't the only factor that was involved, but certainly it was an important factor, and that was a very calamitous and cataclysmic for our nation at the time, a civil war with massive loss of life on both sides.
Yeah, that's right. But ideas of freedom and free markets were spreading throughout the world in the 19th century, becoming ever more solidified in all corners of America, too. So slavery, the clock was ticking. If it hadn't been ended by the Civil War and the subsequent adoptions of constitutional amendments pertaining to it, it would not have lasted all that much longer. Can you imagine today? Think of all the Black Americans that we know who are so amazingly productive. If all of a sudden we made slaves of them, how productive would they be?
All right.
I mean, so I'm suggesting is that that slavery could not, in the long run, compete with the productivity and the efficiency of free labor. I mean, it's a terrible shame it wasn't ended long before it was, but it was on the way out, and it's hard to imagine that it could ever come back.
And yeah, and I certainly hope that's true. I think, because I think we have made a significant moral progress as a species, I think, over time. And I think, a part of that is I guess not long before we saw slavery die out was the rise of liberalism in sort of the classical sense. And one of the foundational elements of that is the equality of all. And yes, you're right that that there was the inconsistency for America's founders. Jefferson wrote those compelling words in the Declaration of Independence, although at the same time he owned slaves, and so there was this tension. But I think it was also, I think, pretty clear. Once you start to recognize the principle that others are your moral equal, and in particular, then I guess the first thing they were saying, that the colonists were trying to say, the king's no better than the rest of us. So why do we have to listen to the king? But once you start to recognize that, everybody's a moral equal of each other, that principle is a hard one to contain.
Yeah, that's right. And when you look at most progress in almost any field of human endeavor, you don't get instant, dramatic, 180-degree turns very often. You usually get a gradual change as people's ideas shift. And then you look back later and say, wow, can you believe we did it that way at one time?
Yeah.
And yet a lot of people want to blame America for slavery, which again is untenable, not only because it wasn't exceptional to us, but also because it's taking today's conventional wisdom and judging people of the past by those standards instead of the context in which they labored. I mean, it would be like saying to the Wright brothers, if you could go back in time, hey, what's the matter with you guys? You've got this rickety old machine here. You call it a plane, but there's no in-flight Wi-Fi. There's no in-flight meals. I mean, you're not even serving wine in first class. I mean, they gave us a huge step in the right direction, but it takes time for progress to blossom.
Well, And I think that's a good point, because I think a lot of times in economics, when studying economics, one of the things we emphasize is the role of discovery, and all of the economic knowledge we have has to be discovered. But I think it also becomes very easy to, once you've discovered something, or once we've made moral progress, to look back and say, why didn't you all know that back then? And it's very hard to realize that it took a long time to learn these things, and very easy to think, oh, how could you ever not have known that?
Yeah, I'm very interested in a very current issue, and that is school choice. And I'm convinced that someday, when we have given parents so much more choice than they have now to send their children to the best and safest schools that they want to, we'll shake our heads and say, can you imagine that our forefathers actually passed laws that said you've got to go to the school that you're assigned to, the government school within your zip code? We'll shake our heads and say, what made us ever think that would produce the best educational opportunities? So even we today, if we may want to get on our moral high horses and proclaim that we're better than previous generations, but maybe future generations will say that same thing about us.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think, as you're right, anyone who wants to condemn those in the past should remember there are things we're doing today that we're likely going to be condemned for in the future. And I think you've got to ask. I think we should all ask ourselves the question, are we bad people because of what somebody in the future might look back and say, you were doing that and that was so bad. How did you not know that?
Yeah. We are imperfect people, all of us. Yeah. Everybody who's ever lived is imperfect. But you'd like to think that with each generation, we learn some things and we pass on good values, and so that the next generation can progress and be better off. But those future generations should always be grateful that there was somebody along the way who helped push things in the right direction, even though we weren't perfect in the process.
No, one of the elements of the 1619 Project, one of the essays in the 1619 Project pushed a rather controversial line about the role of slavery in helping to make America rich. Because as we said, it's relatively recent in human history that we've had prosperity. And so I think that was one of the more controversial parts of the 1619 Project, the essay by Matthew Desmond that was arguing that slavery helped found America's wealth and is somehow responsible for America's wealth today. And if we start to get into this, as we said, it's like if slavery's been so common in human history and prosperity is a new thing, then you sort of have an issue here of if slavery was going to make societies rich, how come humanity wasn't rich long before even the United States came along?
That's right. Yeah, slavery didn't make America rich. It made a small number of people rich, namely slave owners and those perhaps who were closest to them. But it made society as a whole poorer than it would otherwise have been. Just think of the productivity that we didn't see from people who might have been great inventors or entrepreneurs, but were enslaved. Slavery is never good for society as a whole, but it might be good for the ruler, it might be good for the owner, but it's a mistake to conflate that with the good of society as a whole. It isn't.
Yeah, because I think, and what I find so sad about the narrative that perhaps slavery made America rich was that it's really been, I think, the fact that human beings have come to the conclusion that, well, we need to stop trying to command each other or enslave each other, and we need to deal with each other as equals, which if you consider each other to be equals, then the way you deal with the way you should interact with each other is through exchange. And that gets us to the fundamentals of a market economy. And it's when people exchange that you see prosperity take off, because as you suggest, I think it allows all parties to start to use their true human characteristics of intelligence and creativity to be able to come up with ways to do things better.
Exactly. Nobody, no human being will be more productive if somebody else is cracking the whip and telling him what to do at every turn than he would be if he could pursue his own dreams, his ambitions, put his talents to the best possible uses as he sees them. Uh, I mean, there's just no difference between freedom and slavery in terms of the output of the people. Prisons may be a good place to punch out license plates, as prisoners do in some states, but it's not a place where you can expect somebody to invent a new watch, a new iPhone, or you fill in the blank. That's not where innovations and productivity excels. Just the most menial tasks can be done under the terms of slavery, and then you lose out on all the wonderful things free people might have produced.
Yeah, because I mean, I think, as when you look at the plantation system that we had in the American South, as much wealth as that appeared to be creating, and I think there's some question about how much wealth was actually being created, if the landowners were hiring the people who were working for them as free individuals, I mean, I think they would have ended up being much wealthier simply because as free individuals, as we've been talking about, they would likely have been contributing to improving the whole planting process and dozens of other innovations that would have occurred.
Yeah, and really that ought to be self-evident from our observations about humans and human nature. I mean, how are we made? Are we made as robots to be programmed by somebody else? No. Are we all the same from one person to another? Therefore, if we just had the right mastermind in charge, he or she could tell us what to do? No. We are unique creatures, each and every one of us. And that should suggest powerfully that we need freedom, everybody, because you can't be yourself, you can't be the unique person that you are unless you have considerable power over your choices, your destiny. Otherwise, you're not living your life. Somebody else is living their life through you. That ought to be one of the most fundamental assertions of human nature, of sociology, that comes out of every American classroom. I mean, we are made to be free, not to be slaves.
Yeah, because I mean, I think in many ways, like I remember reading the inspiring story of Harriet Tubman, and like even like try to imagine like what it would have been to be born as a slave. But you see her inspiring story there, and you see there's something inside of her that at a very young age seemed to click and realize, like, I'm not going to be anybody's slave. And once she recognized that, once she came to that, then nobody was going to be able to productively hold her in chains and get any productive work out of her. She freed herself, even though then she actually did literally free herself by escaping. But
Yes.
it was the freeing of herself that occurred in her mind first that then led her to seek her freedom.
That's right. And what makes her all the more remarkable are really a couple things. One, once she gained her freedom by escaping, she didn't just say, well, I'm done, I'll just do my thing now. She was committed to the freedom of others and took many great risks to help others from enslaved states to come to freedom in the North or into Canada. And the other reason I love the Tubman story, and this is a part of her that most people don't know, she had a problem from an early age as a slave with frequent migraines and blurry vision. And that it stemmed from someone on the plantation hitting her. I think it was the slave foreman, perhaps. Well, when she was in her 70s, she had an operation. This is, long after she gained her freedom. She had a brain operation and refused anesthesia. And she lived for another 15 years with those problems largely resolved. And she was still occasionally speaking. And she would say things like, yeah, they took the top of my head off and fiddled around in there and put the top back on. Now I feel just fine. I mean, talk about a unique and tough lady. There are just endless stories like that of people who blossom when they're free,
Right.
but don't go very far when they're slaves.
And then I think, from a society standpoint, I mean, the only way you can keep people in slavery is in some ways to make sure that they don't recognize their full humanity. Because once they do, then like in the case of Miss Tubman, I mean, you're not going to be able to keep them as slaves anymore. And like that's just such a waste of potential when you have to have a system in place to keep people from becoming everything they could be.
That's right.
And I suppose in retrospect, it's probably not surprising then that humanity remained poor for so long when those in charge, not just with slaves, but there were serfs and other forms of bondage or subjugation of humans, and trying to keep that in place by keeping people from recognizing, the people you're trying to keep subjugated from recognizing just how wonderful and special they are, and so then they also can't contribute economically.
Yeah, for those very reasons, it was the case in most, if not all, of the old slave states that educating slaves was made illegal, that you could be fined for educating a slave because they didn't want the slaves to learn enough to realize that they were in slavery. It didn't have to be that way, and that they had rights just like everybody else do.
I believe I also remember reading that there were restrictions on even like teaching having the slaves read the Bible or spreading Christianity to the slaves, although if spread informally, but in terms of limits on any church figures trying to go in and talk to the slaves, or for some of these same reasons.
Oh, that's right. It would be wrong to think of the old slave states as monolithic, that, every non-slave favored slavery. No, many people didn't, and paid the price, went to jail because they were caught educating black people who were slaves. So there were a lot of people who were against it and worked against it long before we finally got rid of it.
Yeah, and I think one last way to sort of have a perspective on this is that, in some sense, this is a great triumph for humanity, that we did manage to, in a relatively short, in terms of the long span of human history, a relatively short period of time, we managed to get rid of slavery. And, it was probably about a 100-year span there where slavery was legal everywhere, and then within 100 years it's gone, and like in this whole span of thousands of years of human history, that's just a wink of an eye almost. And so it was in one sense also a lot longer than you might have hoped it to happen, but it also happened relatively amazingly short period of time, and I think liberalism is a big part of that story.
Yeah, absolutely. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And he opened our eyes to the importance of free people and how they don't need a wise guy at the top to tell them how to make an economy run, that free people can be amazingly productive. And increasingly people came to see the wisdom in that. And so in the span of about 100 years, we went from slavery being the accepted norm, being ubiquitous around the world, to being on the run everywhere and abolished in most places. It still exists today, but the number of countries that don't allow it or look the other way is a very small one indeed.
And just one last thing that's close to there is like Thomas Sowell makes the point that it was only sort of like in America that they started having some defenses of slavery, because throughout so much of human history it was thought like there's nothing you even have to defend, it's just nature.
Yeah. Looking back on that, it was we can take it as a sign that slavery was on its way out, that so many people had they felt compelled to come up with arguments to defend it, which, as you point out, they didn't have to do before.
Well, thanks so much, Larry, for coming on and talk about this with us. And thank you all for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.
This has been EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University.